Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here. This is the second time that I've attended the Festival of Faith and Writing. I came, I think, 4 years ago, and I had such a wonderful experience here. It's really an honor to have this time to share with you. Today, I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about my own artistic journey, and specifically, I'd like to talk to you about a question that I've struggled with from time to time, and that question is art selfish? Now, I'm using art in the broadest way possible, so I'm trying to include all of you in this question, whether you're a writer or a poet or a journalist. Personally, I blame my parents for my love of art and for my love of story. My parents are both immigrants. I'm the son of two immigrants. My mom was born in mainland China, my dad in Taiwan. They came over to the States for graduate school, met, fell in love, got married, and had me. 4 years after me, they had my little brother. Here's our family at church. We were raised in the Roman Catholic Church. I am still a practicing Catholic, but you can tell from the picture that as a kid, I was not that thrilled with church. Now, growing up, one of the primary ways that my parents and I interacted with each other was through storytelling. Both of my parents were avid storytellers. My dad generally made stories up off the top of his head, and they were usually about this Taiwanese village boy named Atong. As an adult, I look back on these Atong stories, and I realized that Atong was probably a stand-in for my dad. And I think he was telling me these stories to get me to be grateful that I wasn't living Atong's life. My favorite of these Atong stories were about how Atong's dad would make him do all these really disgusting chores at their house. My absolute favorite when I was 6 was about how Atong's dad gave him a pair of chopsticks and this rice bowl, and Atong had to go to the front of their house and pick up this cow manure with these chopsticks and put it in the rice bowl. As a 6-year-old, I thought it was hilarious. And to be honest, I still kind of think it's hilarious. Now, my mom was more classy. My mom actually asked her parents, who were living in Taiwan when I was growing up, to send over a whole bunch of English language storybooks. Chinese language storybooks. And she would read to me out of these storybooks, read to me and my brother out of these storybooks at bedtime. Again, I think as an adult, I realized that the stories were more than just stories. She was trying to connect me with her past. Eventually, as my brother and I got older, we started retelling our parents' stories, and then we started modifying them, and then we started creating stories of our own. So I really grew up in this storytelling community of 4, and I think this is probably true for most families out there. Most families are these little storytelling communities. So I grew up listening to stories. I also grew up drawing. My mom tells me that I started drawing when I was 2 years old, and I basically didn't stop. So naturally, when you take stories and drawing and you add them together, you get animation. Animation was probably the very first form of drawn storytelling that I was exposed to. When I was little, I loved watching cartoons on the television. I loved watching animated movies in the theater. In fact, when I was little, my lifelong ambition was to work for this guy. I really, really wanted to be a Disney animator. In 3rd grade, our teacher made us do these biography reports. I chose to do mine on Walt Disney, and after that, I became obsessed with him. I remember going to the library, checking out as many different books about his life that I could find. I remember practicing drawing in that classic Disney style. I remember looking up in the encyclopedia when his death date was, because I was hoping it would match my birth date, because that would mean that I might be his reincarnation. That did not work out. I even remember going to the mall, going to the poster store, and buying this giant poster-sized headshot of Walt Disney. I hung it up in my bedroom, and my friends would come over and they'd say, "Why do you have this giant picture of a creepy old man in your bedroom?" And I'd have to tell them, that's not just any creepy old man, that's Walt Disney. So I desperately wanted to be a Disney animator. But this all changed in 5th grade. 5th grade was when I made the transition from being just a regular geek to being a comic book geek. And it happened one night when my mom took me to our local bookstore. When I was growing up, local bookstores had these things called spinner racks. And these were wireframe racks that would carry a month's worth of comics, and you could spin them all so that you could see all of them. Now, I'm pretty sure before this night, I had seen comics before, and I may have even read comics before. But for some reason, on this one fateful night, I go to the bookstore and I see this issue of Marvel 2-in-1 sitting on the spinner rack. As soon as I see it, I know from the very depths of my being that I want to own it. Now, I'm not sure why that is. This is like a pre-logical reaction that I had to this. Marvel 2-in-1 is a series that they don't really publish anymore, but this is where Marvel Comics would take two of their characters that didn't normally hang out together and put them together to have an adventure. In this issue, it was The Thing and Rom. Anyone know who The Thing is? Have you all heard of The Thing? Okay, a lot of you. The Thing is pretty popular. He's part of the Fantastic Four. He shows up in summer blockbuster movies and in Saturday morning cartoons every now and then. Does anyone know who Rom is? Nobody. Nowadays, just time has not been very kind to Rom. Nowadays, you have to be a hardcore geek to know who Rom is. In fact, this is how geeks recognize each other, right? They go, do you know who Rom is? He's at Space Night, isn't he? Oh, all right, you're one of us. So I don't know what it was about The Thing and Rom that captured my imagination. I think it was just the fact that these two characters look so different from each other, but they're still so awesome. So I brought this issue up to my mom and I said, Mom, from the depths of my being, I want to own this. Can you please buy it for me? She took one look at this cover and she said, no, absolutely not. Those two characters look way too scary. Put it back on the spinner rack. So I did. So to this day, I have no idea what this comic was about. Now, instead, she bought me this. This was the latest issue of Superman. As we all know, Superman is every parent's favorite superhero. He's not scary looking at all. In fact, he's kind of good looking. He always does the right thing. He never says any bad words. He doesn't punch anybody unless he really has to. And afterwards, he feels all guilty about it. He has this bright blue costume that he wears. So he's like this giant flying Boy Scout. Well, I was disappointed that this was the comic that I got, but I took it home and I read it. And in this book, the atomic bomb drops in 1986. It's 1984 as I'm reading it. The atomic bomb drops in 1986. It kills off most of the world's population. And the few remnants of humanity that are left, they gather themselves in these small, feudal societies that are pretty lawless. So a group of men have to get together, dress themselves in medieval-style armor, and ride around the countryside on these giant mutated dogs to fight crime. Superman, being Superman, is one of the survivors, so he teams up with these guys. They call themselves the Atomic Knights. And they have this epic adventure. In the last 3 pages of this book, it's revealed that the entire story is actually just a dream that somebody's having. But that did not stop this book from completely freaking me out. I stayed up nights thinking about it, thinking about the bomb, because it was the 80s, thinking about Superman and Atomic Knights and giant mutated dogs, and about comic books, about how this combination of words and pictures did something to my brain that neither words nor pictures had been able to do before. Within weeks of becoming a comic book reader, I became a comic book creator. And this is actually one of my favorite aspects of comics, of both the industry and the culture. That dividing line between reader and creator, that dividing line between fan and pro, is just very thin and very permeable. Basically, if you want to become a comic book creator, all you really need is a pencil, some paper, and a healthy ignorance of your own artistic limitations. You go home, you draw a comic, and there you go. You are now a comic book creator. That's basically what I did in 5th grade. In 5th grade, my best friend was this kid named Jeremy. And by then, Jeremy had already become this veteran comic book geek. He had boxes and boxes of comics underneath his bed. Together, we began making comics. We would brainstorm stories together. I would do all the pencils, he would do all the inks, and then we would give these originals to his mom, who would take them to her work, wait till all our coworkers went home, and sneak photocopies for us. Then we would take these photocopies, we would staple them together, and we would sell them to our classmates for 50 cents a piece. We made something like $8. It was pretty glorious. Our comics were all about this character named the Spade Hunter, who was kind of like Robin. He wore all green, he had a feather in his cap, but instead of a bow and arrow, he fought with this giant discus of death that he would throw at people's heads. At the end of the day, we took that $8 and we donated it to the Restore the Statue of Liberty Fund. So when I was a kid, the Statue of Liberty was going through these issues, and during after-school cartoons, they would run these ads about how her nose was about to rust off. Jeremy and I are incredibly patriotic, so we decided to donate these $8 to the Restore the Statue of Liberty Fund, and our teacher was so proud of us that she gave us these McDonald's gift certificates that were worth more than $8. To this day, that is the best financial decision I've ever made as a cartoonist. Now, during this time, my storytelling community had shrunk. It had gone from the 4 people in my family to just me and Jeremy, to a storytelling community of 2. Jeremy and I would tell each other stories, and then we would produce these stories as comic books. We spent a lot of lunch periods isolated from the rest of our classmates. We would sit on the steps right outside of our classroom and work on these comics. So was this selfish for us to be this isolated? At the time, it really didn't feel like that. I mean, it's not like they were missing us at the baseball field. I am terrible at baseball. I'm actually terrible at any sport with a ball in it. Actually, to be honest, I'm terrible at any sport. So it didn't feel, even though we were isolated, it didn't feel selfish. Now, eventually, Jeremy stopped making comics. He is now a radiologist living in a giant house in Hawaii. He could probably buy me if he wanted to. But I kept going. I kept making comics through the 5th grade, through the 6th grade, into junior high. When I got into high school, I had this dilemma. When I thought about my career, I wondered, did I want to pursue animation as I had originally intended, or did I want to make comic books? So I weighed these 2 options very carefully against a set of criteria. I'm going to share some of those criteria with you now. First, time. I wondered, which of these art forms will take up more hours of my life? Now, comics are incredibly time-intensive. A page of comics can take anywhere from 4 to 16 hours to produce, and if you multiply that by the 200 or so pages that you need to create a graphic novel, that's a significant amount of your life. But even though comics are time-intensive, they don't hold a candle to animation. Animation is so time-intensive, so labor-intensive, that it's very difficult for a single person to produce a story of any substance. Most animated stories are produced in these teams, where dozens and dozens of people contribute thousands and thousands of hours. So in terms of time, it seems like comics won. How about money? Which of these art forms will make me more money? Well, in animation, they have this little thing that is virtually unheard of within the comic book industry. It's this thing called health insurance. In animation, you can actually create a career for yourself. You can get health insurance and a stable paycheck and a stable living. All of these things are very, very difficult to come by in comics. So in terms of money, animation wins. How about sex appeal? Which one of these art forms will make me sexier? Well, to be honest, I don't know if animation makes you sexy, but clearly it makes you sexier than comics, right? I mean, if you are trying to get a date, you'll get much farther telling somebody that you worked on Frozen versus Rom the Space Knight. So animation versus comics, animation wins 2-1. It seems like I should have been an animator. But there is one more factor that I believe gives comics the advantage, at least in my eyes, and that's this. Because animation is so labor-intensive, the storytelling communities that make animation are huge. They're gigantic, dozens and dozens of people. Because of this, it's very difficult for one individual voice to be heard. And in fact, most animators don't own their own creations. They don't control the stories that they tell. In fact, most animators are using their talents to tell other people's stories. In comics, it is just not like that. Superhero comics are basically about as corporate as comics can get. And even in this corporate environment, the storytelling communities are much smaller. Behind your average superhero title is maybe a team of 5 or 6 people. There's an editor, an artist, sometimes an inker, sometimes a colorist, and a letterer, maybe an editor. Very small, tight communities. But the corner of the comic book industry that I was most interested in was American independent comics. And in American independent comics, you very frequently have storytelling communities of one. You have one person handle all of the writing and all of the drawing, and sometimes even all of the publishing. Now, when you have storytelling communities of one, you deal with a lot of loneliness and isolation. But in return for that loneliness and isolation, you get control. You get complete control over a project from beginning to end. I think if you look at a lot of independent cartoonists, you will find within their hearts this deep desire for control. And I gotta be honest, those of you who are novelists out there, look into your hearts. I bet you have that same desire. Now, this desire was expressed in one of my favorite superhero comics. It's a Fantastic Four graphic novel. It's done by Mark Waid and Mike Wieringo, two of the most talented modern comics creators. And in this story, it's called Hereafter. In this story, the Fantastic Four actually visit the afterlife, which looks strangely in the Marvel Universe like outer space. So in the middle of the afterlife, they come to this door, and they know on the other side of this door is God, is the Almighty. They open the door, and they find themselves in the art studio of Jack Kirby, the co-creator of Fantastic Four. Most of us who are independent cartoonists, this is what we want to be. We want to be to our creations what Jack Kirby was to the Fantastic Four. We want to be the gods of our own little universes. So I made my choice. After college, I began my two careers. I began teaching high school computer science, and I also began making comic books. Around this time, I fell in with a group of other Bay Area cartoonists, and we began meeting on a weekly basis. We met every Tuesday night at somebody's house where we would write together, draw together, read each other's works, talk shop, give each other critique. I never went to art school, so this group, we used to call ourselves Art Night because we were doing art at night. Art Night was basically like my art school. Now, even though we were meeting together, we each had our own individual projects. So we were a community, but we were a community that looked like this. We were basically a collection of our own little universes. This was all during my 20s. And during this period, I was very prolific as a cartoonist. I made a lot of comics. I self-published a series called Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks, about this young man who gets a spaceship stuck in his nose, and he becomes friends with the alien that's driving the ship, and he learns all these deep life lessons. I also did a series of photocopied comics, which eventually became my 2006 graphic novel, American Born Chinese. So during my 20s, I spent a lot of time isolated. I spent a lot of time in my storytelling community of one. Was this selfish? This question during this time would perk up from time to time in the back of my mind, but it very rarely made it all the way to the front of my mind. There was one exception. During this one summer, I had the opportunity to lead a tutoring program with my high school students. So in this program, I would take the kids in my computer science classes and lead them through a local charitable organization in a summer-long program for disadvantaged elementary school kids. So my students would be tutoring these elementary school students. I thought about it for a long time. In the end, I chose against it because I wanted to use that summer to work on my comics. Those kids did get tutored. Somebody else ended up leading this project, but was that selfish of me to make that choice? A few years after this, I got married. Now, marriage is basically a community of two, right? And it's a community of two that often calls you out of the other communities that you're a part of. You would think that during this period, there'd be this conflict between my new community of two and my comics community of one. But generally, there wasn't. Part of that is because my wife is an incredibly generous and understanding person. And part of it is just the fact that after we got married, we lived in a tiny, tiny one-bedroom apartment. My drawing table was right next to our kitchen table. My wife was working as a fourth grade teacher at the time, so she did all of her grading at the kitchen table. Whenever I was isolated within my own world of comics, I was physically right next to my wife. So it felt like we were still together. But then, a few years after I got married, this happened. This is my son. He is the first of 4 now. And if you have ever struggled with questions of selfishness, parenthood will make you feel the full weight of those questions. After my son was born, art began to feel really, really selfish because every hour that I spent on my comics was an hour that I could have spent with my baby boy. I'm definitely not the only one to have gone through this struggle. I have a friend named Greg Willits. He is a blogger and a podcaster. He does a podcast with his wife called The Catholics Next Door. And in one of his recent blog posts, he wrote about giving up art shortly after he became a father. He said this, he said, "I had children to feed now and a mortgage, and creative pursuits, and the romantic notion of being a starving artist and a modern-day bohemian felt selfish." This sentiment of the selfishness of art, of the isolation of art, is echoed throughout human history. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Artists must be sacrificed to their art. Like bees, they must put their lives into the sting that they give." Is it okay for you to sacrifice your life to your art when you have people who are dependent on you for their own lives? Oscar Wilde said that art is the most intense mode of individualism that the world has ever known. Is it okay for you to retreat into individualism, into your own private storytelling community of one when you have family obligations? Well, world-famous dancer Mikhail Baryshnikov. I'm sure Gorbachev is a great dancer as well, so I hope that doesn't come off as an insult. But Baryshnikov gives a pretty stern and emphatic answer to this. He said in an interview, "People of art just should never get married and have children because it's a selfish experience." So after my child was born, it felt like fatherhood was calling me out of comics. It felt like the demands of life were incompatible with my storytelling community of one. A friend of mine, Derek Kirk Kim, he's immensely talented and he's part of Art Night. So we kind of came up in comics together. Derek did this book in 2003 called Same Difference. I would encourage you to check it out. One of the best graphic novels this country has ever produced. It won all 3 major comic book industry awards. It won an Eisner, an Ignatz, and an Harvey. Well, Derek recently announced that he was quitting comics. And he was quitting because he found that living in a storytelling community of one was too isolating, too lonely, and too selfish. On the day that he quit, he posted this graphic to his Facebook page. It says, "Drawing leads to dreams. Dreams lead to comics, and comics lead to suffering." I personally feel this suffering on a regular basis. You know, my wife and I, we're lucky enough that we no longer live in that 1-bedroom apartment. We now live in a house where I actually have my own little studio. It's a spare bedroom with a door. When I'm working, I keep that door locked. But almost every day, I'll hear this little patter of feet, and then I'll hear some scratching at my door, and then some knocking, and then finally some yelling. "Daddy! Daddy, are you in there?" And then if I don't respond, I'll see this under my door. My children are trying to invade my storytelling community of one. American-Born Chinese was released in 2006, and it was basically a collection of all the Xerox comics that I did throughout my late 20s and early 30s. And this marked a turning point for me. This was when comics stopped being an expense and started being an income. When I was self-publishing comics, every time I self-published, I'd lose maybe $1,000. Every time I did a Xerox comic, I'd lose maybe $100. American-Born Chinese was the very first time that comics actually brought in money to my family. And I gotta be honest, money did relieve some of the feelings of selfishness that I was having about my art, but it didn't do it in the right way, right? Because it brought up this question, is money the only way to justify art? If I hadn't gotten that publishing deal for American-Born Chinese, would all those hours that I had spent on it be seen as selfish? That just doesn't seem right. Recently, I asked my wife, who has been with me throughout my cartooning career, who has seen me at my most selfish moments, I asked her, do you think that art is selfish? She thought about it for a moment and she said, well, it can be. And I think she's right. My wife is very wise, which is why I married her, that and the fact that she's just incredibly good looking. But her answer implies that art can be either selfish or selfless, right? That brings up a further question. What is the difference between these two types of art? What's the difference between selfish art and selfless art? Well, I don't think I have a good answer to this, in part because I don't think a good one exists. I don't think there is a very clear demarcation between selfishness and selflessness within art. I don't think it's a binary proposition. But at the same time, I would like to share with you 4 different ways of thinking about art that have helped me in my own life, that I feel like at least have pointed me in the right direction. The first way is this: think of art as an icon. I don't mean a computer icon here, I mean an icon in the classic Eastern Orthodox sense. Years ago, I had the opportunity to go on this retreat that was led by an Eastern Orthodox deacon who is also a painter of icons. And what I learned is that icon painting is this very intense discipline because the icon is supposed to point you to something higher than itself. Now, most icon painters, before they start, they go through these long periods of fasting and praying. And then when they feel ready to paint, they're not trying to create something new in the world. They're not trying to express something creative. Most icons are actually copies of previously existing icons. After an icon is copied over and over and over again, these small differences begin to emerge, right? And these small differences are seen not as an expression of the individual artist, but as an expression of the community that the artist belongs to. So for instance, maybe Christ's skin will get darker, or maybe his eyes will get lighter, or maybe his look will go from one of determination to lovingness. These little changes are seen as an expression of a community, and the icon painters take this idea so seriously that they don't even sign their work. Those of us who do sign our work, I think we can learn something from these icon painters. Even if we are trying to express something new, even if we're trying to be creative, we have to remember the most radical of our ideas are still built on top of stories that have been told by communities that preceded us. We are still part of a tradition. And if we're lucky, the stories that we tell now will be used as fodder for future stories told by future communities. It's important for us to remember, like those icon painters, that we are part of a lineage. We are part of something bigger than ourselves. The second way of thinking is this: think of art as a prayer. This is a connection that my friend Greg made. In that same blog post that I mentioned earlier, he says this about the connection between prayer and creativity. He's speaking as a Catholic. He says, creativity allows the Holy Spirit to work through us to create something else. In that sense, it could be like a prayer. This realization actually led him to take up art again. So nowadays, you can find him happily painting in a studio in his home. Now, I personally have also noticed this connection between art and prayer, but I experienced it a little bit differently than the way Greg did. For me, I noticed that before I write and before I pray, I'm filled with the same sense of dread. Like, I just really don't want to do it. I would rather do anything else. I'd rather do the dishes. I'd rather vacuum. I'd rather check my email. I'd rather go on Facebook. I'd rather reorganize my Transformers. I'd rather do anything than sit down and write or pray. The Buddhists have a concept that describes this. They call it the monkey mind. So here's my interpretation of this concept. Inside of each of our brains is a monkey, and this monkey is constantly restless and unfocused. And if you want to be productive, if you want to be at peace, you have to find a way to calm that monkey down. So for me, both prayer and writing can do this. If I force myself to sit down and write, if I force myself to sit down and pray, sooner or later, I get into the zone. I get into what psychologists these days are calling flow, right? This state of being at peace, of being productive, and being present to where you are at that moment. So you have to find a way to tame that monkey. And I think writing and prayer can both do this. My wife actually has noticed this in my life. A lot of time, if I'm really grumpy and irritable, she'll ask me, "When was the last time you worked on your comics?" And usually it will have been a while ago. So writing and prayer can both do this for you. The third way of thinking about art is this. Think about art as an organ. And I don't mean like the musical organ that you play. I mean a bodily organ, an internal organ, like your liver. Now, the liver is vital to the human body, right? A human body cannot function without the liver. In the same way, I think art is vital to the artist. Many artists can't function without their art. But at the same time, we have to remember that the human body is not all art. You do not see people like this walking down the street. It would be incredibly creepy. Artists also cannot be all art. Most of us, we create our art from our own lives. If our lives only consist of the pursuit of art, then our lives and our art become these mirror images that reflect each other endlessly. And this sort of thing is only interesting for a few moments. If we do this, if we make our lives all art, we become what Neil Gaiman describes as skilled writers with nothing to say. To people like this, Gaiman offers the following advice. He says, go get a job somewhere. Go around the world. Go do stuff. Go get your heart broken, and then come back and write. In other words, build a life for yourself that is not all art. Do not be all liver. The final way of thinking about art that I'd like to share with you is this. Think of art as an act of service. Now, human beings are a religious species. And I think one way we can think of religion is as a collection of stories that bind a community together. Now, as a religious person myself, I think religion is more than that. But it certainly isn't less. Religion is not less than stories. When my wife and I were first married, we lived in Oakland, and around Easter time, this was a pretty common sight. This is a parish community praying the Stations of the Cross. The Stations of the Cross is a Catholic devotional prayer that takes you through the final moments of Christ's earthly life. This is pretty big in Mexican and Filipino communities. So a lot of these parishioners would go and they would pray these stations along the streets just outside of the church. The parishioners would dress up as Jesus and as Mary and as the disciples and as the supporting cast from the Gospels. And this has always struck me as a demonstration of just how important our stories are to us. Our stories are so important that we want to embody them. We want to immerse ourselves in them. We want to become a part of them. And this certainly isn't just a Western impulse. Here's a picture of a group of young Thai women embodying Guanyin, the goddess of mercy. And it also can be found, this impulse can be found in modern secular culture. If you go to any comic book convention, anywhere in the nation, you will find people like this. They're called cosplayers, and they are embodying their stories, the stories that are important to them. The other day, or the other year, I was hanging out at a Comic-Con with my editor, Mark Siegel, and a group of these cosplayers passed us. And after they passed us, Mark turned to me and said, "Don't you think it feels like there's something religious going on here?" And I think he's right. I think there is something religious going on here. There's this deep desire for story that's being expressed by these young people. Now, it makes sense to me why story is so important to us, right? Story actually gives us a map. Art, in general, gives us a map so that we can figure out who we are and where we fit in the world. Art and story tell us how to organize our lives. In fact, that's why I think my parents told my brother and me stories. That's why they raised us within a faith tradition. They wanted to, unconsciously maybe, or maybe consciously, but they wanted to equip us with these stories that we could use to find our place in the world, to navigate through life and organize ourselves. Given this, having kids is not a reason to stop making art. It's not a reason to stop telling stories. It is actually a reason to start, because just like we did, the next generation is going to need those maps. They're going to need some help to find their way through this world. They're going to need some help to figure out who they are. I'd like to end with a quote from my own faith tradition. Pope John Paul II, towards the end of his papacy, wrote a letter to artists where he actually examined the relationship between faith and art in society. And in this letter, he had this to say. He said, "There is therefore an ethic, even a spirituality of artistic service, which contributes in its way to the life and the renewal of a people." So art is a service that renews a people. Art is a service that renews a people. I would encourage all of us at this festival and beyond to continue doing what we're doing, to continue making art, to continue telling stories, and to continue to bring a renewal to our people. Thank you very much for this time. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.